What happens when the most important work of your life begins not with a bold new vision, but with a quiet return? Jason G. Green was living what many would call a dream, working in the White House, close to power, influence, and national decision-making. And then the phone rang. His grandmother was dying. Jason left Washington and went home, not to fix anything, not to solve a problem. He went home to sit at her bedside and listen. What unfolded there was more than a family story. It was the uncovering of a forgotten community, a reckoning with faith, memory, and loss, and an invitation to reconsider what we mean when we talk about belonging. Today's conversation is about the wisdom that comes when we slow down enough to listen, about communities that shaped us long before we knew their names, and about leadership that begins not by moving faster, but by paying closer attention. Hello, friends. I'm Alan Fadling, and you're listening to the Unhurried Living Podcast, where we seek to rest deeper, live fuller, and lead better. If you're new to the podcast, welcome. I'm really glad you've found us. And if this conversation resonates with you, I invite you to subscribe and share the podcast with friends or colleagues who might need this kind of reflection right now. My guest today is Jason G. Green, author of the brand new memoir, Too Precious to Lose. In this deeply moving book, Jason tells the story of returning home to sit with his grandmother in what seemed to be her final days, and how her stories opened a doorway into a hidden history he had never been told. That history centers on Quince Orchard, a once thriving African-American community in Maryland whose legacy lived on quietly, carried by memory, faith, and resilience. As Jason listens, researches, and remembers, he uncovers more than the past. He discovers wisdom about community, courage, repair, and what it truly means to belong. Wisdom that feels especially urgent in today's fractured and hurried world. Jason is a community organizer, attorney, entrepreneur, and a former special assistant and associate White House counsel to President Obama. He's also a filmmaker and the creator of the PBS documentary Finding Fellowship, which explores the history at the heart of this book. I'm grateful for this conversation, and I think you will be too. Here now is my interview with Jason G. Green. Well, Jason, it is such a pleasure to be able to have this conversation today. Thanks so much for joining me.
Well, it's the pleasure's mine, Alan. Thank you so much for having me.
Well, I'm looking forward very much to talking about your book, Too Precious to Lose. There's such a beautiful story, you and your family and some of the history. But maybe before we talk about your grandmother and the journey that unfolds at her bedside, would you tell me a little bit about what life was like when you got the phone call about her then declining health and where you were and what you were doing and what that was like?
I'm so glad that you started there, but I might even pull us back a little bit further on how we got there. When I got that phone call, as you know, I was 4 years into service as associate White House counsel in the Obama White House. But I had grown up in Gaithersburg, Maryland. I grew up on a dirt road, the same dirt road that my grandmother had grown up on, that my father had grown up on. And so I was really deeply ensconced in community. Sometimes when people ask, Alan, they'll say, what do we need to know about you? And I say, all you need to know is I'm the product of a Methodist preacher and a public school teacher and an activist grandmother. Right? That combination is who I was. Well,
there you go.
I left the Gaithersburg area for college. I went to Washington University in St. Louis and then found my way at Yale Law School and got kind of swept up on a path. I joined the Obama campaign and then was in the Obama White House and had sort of been consumed in this pursuit of importance and dare I say self-importance, so that I hadn't been home in some time. When I went off to law school, when I went off to the campaign, when I went to the White House, even though it was only 35 miles from where I grew up, I hadn't been home in a while, and I had been busy. I'd been pretty busy, hurried, some might say. Uh,
Mm.
and I'd been too busy to kind of hear this story and sit with my grandmother. And so 4 years into time in the Obama administration, and I get a call from my mother, and I'm embarrassed to say the first time that call came in, I sent it to voicemail.
Oh.
She called again, and it was unusual. This time, she didn't call my cell phone. She called the office number, which meant she had to call the office, the White House switchboard, who then sent that phone number to me. And so when I answered it, I got the call, as you said, that my grandmother, who was then 95 years old, had fallen ill and was in the hospital. And that was the wake-up call in many respects that I needed. And so I was a little scared to go and see. My grandmother had been the center of my world. I lived at the bottom of the street. She lived at the top of the street when we were growing up. And that's where we got dropped off before and after school. And the irony, Ellen, is that because my grandmother volunteered at the local hospital, 5-year-old Jason volunteered at the local hospital.
Oh,
And so
wow.
she would take me along with her, right? And we'd sit in these rooms, and I'd watch her sit with people late in life and offer what I would call, gifts of dignity, right? She'd sit there with a daily devotional, or she'd sit there with a steady hand or a joke or an ice chip. She always knew what to do. And I got to see firsthand what it looked like to be in service. Well, the irony, which having read the book, is that hospital that she used to take me to, that was my introduction of service, was the same place that she was now at 95. And so when I got the wake-up call, it literally was me feeling pulled to now go and sit and offer her that same gift of dignity that I'd watched her give so many other people. And I said, I may not be as skilled as she was, but I can offer a steady hand. I can read the daily devotional, and maybe I can just be present in those moments if she needs me.
Wow. That's remarkable. Well, I appreciate that story. So you stepped away from this role in the White House, that pace, and you returned home. So what was it like to be sitting there at your grandmother's bedside? And what did it invite from you to just be there to listen?
It's so interesting because I didn't immediately leave the administration. At first, I thought this was me heading out to see grandma for a Sunday afternoon. And as I sat, and my mother was there, and my grandmother was there, and they were just in this beautiful conversation where my kind of volleying back and forth, where my mom was asking my grandmother kind of the greatest hits of her story. And I was learning about the woman that my grandmother was, right? She was always grandma to me, but before that, she was Ida Pearl Green. And to understand who she was and where she had been and her story of faith was really moving to me. And so I was kind of being introduced to a new person. And you framed it really well, that I was on this kind of hurried pace in the administration, and as I describe it, on this sort of path of self-importance. When I called my sister, I was like, did you know that grandma did this, this, and this? Expecting her to be ignorant like me. She said, of course I know. How did you not know? Because she had sort of carved out this time over the years. When we were in high school, my sister went and had breakfast with my grandmother every morning and got to hear a story and be in fellowship, right? And by the time I got to high school, I wanted to be anywhere but sitting in my grandmother's kitchen having breakfast. And so I realized that over that time period, I had consumed myself with being busy and not really making time. And so now in that room, where kind of time slowed down and there was nothing more important than sitting with this woman who had been at kind of every milestone along my journey, I was floored by, I'd been on this path to kind of create history. And here she was, this personification of history, right? Like I had been trying to pursue it, and it had been at my breakfast table the whole time. And so that was really powerful. And so ultimately, to your question, I end up leaving the administration because I feel pulled to sort of sit at that bedside and hear all of these stories that I had been sort of too busy to hear before.
That's amazing. So, she shared stories about her life, but then this story of a community that you hadn't fully known about begins to surface. What surprised you most as she shared some of that story with you?
I'm embarrassed to say all of it was surprising to me. So as I framed it when we started talking, I grew up in the same community that my grandmother did, and so when I grew up, it was called Gaithersburg, Maryland, sort of suburb of Washington D.C. I feel like my time period from the 80s to the 90s was this sort of end of a transition from rural to suburban. Well, what was really interesting is my grandmother, as we sat there, one of our sessions, she said, "Oh, I miss my hometown." And I said, "Grandma, I thought this was a sign of senility. We were in this facility. I was looking for a tell." And she said, "I miss my hometown." I said, "Grandma, we're in your hometown. We're in Gaithersburg." And that's what she said. I didn't grow up in Gaithersburg. I'm not from Gaithersburg. I'm from a place called Quince Orchard. Now, I had heard of Quince Orchard. I grew up off of Quince Orchard Road. I went to Quince Orchard High School, but I had never heard it described as a place. And I foolishly thought to try and correct my grandmother. I said, "Oh, Grandma, woe was you. Quince Orchard is not a place. It's a road. And this is so sad that a once sharp woman is now, is in mental decline." Well, this was like agree to disagree. I left that night and couldn't kind of get over the little hustle with my grandmother about this place. And so I ended up doing some research. I found my way into the Washington Post archives and found an article from 1908 that encouraged Washingtonians to get out of the city. And it listed little towns along the way that you should go visit. One of which was Quince Orchard, which shocked me. And in that article, it said, noted for its churches. Now, the first thing I did, Alan, was I ran back into my grandmother's hospital room and I said, "Grandma, did you know that Quince Orchard was a place?" And of course, she gave me the biggest eye roll you've ever seen.
Yeah. Do I know? Is that what you're asking?
Exactly. Do you remember the fight we had yesterday where you challenged my authority on this? But and it's odd, right? And you can appreciate this point, right? Until you see it in print, sometimes it's the text that moves us, but somehow seeing that name in print gave license and authority to the story that she was telling me. And so I then wanted to begin this journey and figure out, okay, well, what was Quince Orchard? And if it existed in a way that my grandmother knew it as her hometown and my father knew it as his hometown, how was it that by the time I came along, I didn't even know that Quince Orchard was ever a place?
That's amazing. Yeah. And so, I've reading your book and then having a chance to look at the PBS documentary that you produced, Finding Fellowship, it's called, isn't it?
That's right. Yes.
Yeah. So there's this story that you uncover that's just a remarkable story. I wonder if you could tell a little bit of it, because you really unpack it in the book, of course.
Yes. So in that newspaper article that calls out Quince Orchard for being noted for its churches, I had to kind of pull that thread. So I remember going to my grandmother and saying, why is Quince Orchard noted for its churches, whereas the neighboring town, Darnestown, is listed as noted for, nothing? And so part of the power of the story goes back 100 years. So my family, through this book, I articulate how, going back to the 1860s, my great-great-grandfather helped the community amass $54 to buy 3 acres of land to build a schoolhouse, to build the church, and establish the cemetery, which became the cornerstones for this African-American community of Quince Orchard. So that was amazing to me, that that community of doers would come together and facilitate that. And then 100 years later, my grandmother's generation, how that church was falling on hard times. The transition from a rural community was beginning. It just didn't have the density in the churches. This is a story we're familiar with. They didn't have the bodies in the seats to sustain the church. And so they were trying to figure out what they were going to do. And so one night, the church gathered, right, for a meal, as we churchgoers do. They gathered in that 100-year-old building to have a meal and discuss their uncertain future. And literally there was the proverbial knock at the door where the pastor came in and let the congregants know that Dr. Martin Luther King had just been assassinated in Memphis, Tennessee.
Wow.
And as you can imagine, the meeting devolved. He took those congregants out of the building, and they all encircled the flagpole, and he prayed. He prayed for the country, but he prayed for courage. He prayed that congregation might have courage in this moment, because one of the things that they were considering that was on the table was whether or not that church that was, built from a legacy from enslavement, whether that congregation would in fact merge with two other congregations, one of which was Northern and one of which was Southern, who had split themselves, as the Methodist Church had split over the issue of slavery in the 1840s. And as we all know, they decided those three churches decided to come together. And in 1968, they merged and became an integrated congregation. And so that was one of and going back to your first question and being with my grandmother, hearing that story was one of the things that animated me. I needed to hear more. I wanted to hear about this place, Quince Orchard. I wanted to understand what was planted in that soil that would allow for a decision like this to take place. And so then I ended up leaving the administration to be present, to really explore how this came to be and how it sustained itself.
That's amazing. Yeah, just reading that story, I mean, as you say, from the early sort of middle 19th century Civil War era sort of dynamics. So I'm curious, this journey you've been on then, from the White House to listening to your grandmother, and then just continuing there. I'd love to hear about sort of your vocational journey, your leadership journey. What has that been like to make that journey over the last, whatever it's been, 15 years, 20 years?
Yeah. Well, part of that has been, I would say, my grandmother's wisdom in sort of helping me explore this story. So when I left the administration, I thought that I would go and sit with my grandmother and hear her story.
Yeah.
My grandmother would hear my enthusiasm perk up on a particular topic, and she would encourage me to then go. She's like, oh, if you like that part of the story, then you should go sit with Miss Johnson. You should go sit with Miss Howard. Or you should go sit with Miss Blair. And I can't tell you how much being able to sit with people, to sit with someone and bear witness, sit with someone and truly doff significance, to sit with someone and understand their story, like that exercise of empathy, that in so many ways has affected this vocational and leadership journey for me. It's made me a better lawyer. It made me a better technologist. It made me a better grandson. It's made me a better family member, to be able to just sit in reflection and deeply appreciate the subject matter, the person with which I'm engaging. I remember Miss Alma Ridgely, who was one of the women that was really foundational in these churches coming together. I had the great pleasure of interviewing her. And at one point she said, Jason, why are you doing all this? I said, what do you mean, Miss Ridgely? She said, well, why are you filming this? Why are you? And I said, because what you guys did in 1968 was important. It was significant. And it struck me that she needed someone else to validate that, because she was just living, right? They were surviving. They were trying to figure out how to make their church survive and their community survive. And so it takes sometimes that external validator to be able to say, you are significant and what you've done is significant. And I want to demonstrate that by giving you of my time and my resource. And so my own journey has been blessed tremendously by having had that experience. And so to give you a sense of kind of the journey that I was on before, going all the way back, I remember sneaking down into the basement on Saturday nights watching my dad start to prepare his sermon for Sunday mornings, and working on and trying to find out which emotional invocation he's going to deploy. And I said, that's what I'm going to do. I want to be like my dad. And so I started to try and mirror his cadences and, read his books. And I remember when my dad pulled me aside and said, find your path. On your path. If you choose a ministry, your life will never be your own. And I chose a path of service in a different direction. But similarly, when I think about what leadership is, it's love. It is a manifestation of service. And so I wanted to find a way to give of myself as I saw my father doing in the pulpit, as I saw my mother doing in the classroom, and as I saw my grandmother doing in the community.
That's so beautiful. I love what you said just a moment ago, in a sense that leadership is love. I think a lot of folks do not have quite that vision of what leadership is or how it works. I wonder if you could just think out loud a little bit more about that unique vision of leadership.
Yeah, it's really funny. I used to help train people to run for political office. I helped a dear friend of mine, Ravi Gupta, just a visionary, founded an organization called The Arena. And I was one of the co-founders, and we would travel around the country and really try and capture and inspire people with the skill sets to run for office. I remember I was in front of the audience at one of these events, and I was beating the table and saying how much we needed talent and right in this moment to move the needle. And someone came up to me and they said, I'm bought in. I want to know what I can do. What's the most important thing for being successful in a political campaign? And I said what I said to you. I said, well, leadership is a manifestation of service. You have to love. You got to love your constituents. And he looked at me and he said, well, what's the second most important thing?
Right.
I said it's kind of an order of first principle thing, right? If you don't get one, there's no use in going down the list. And so I think you're right. There is often a conception and I think that's an example is a good one, that we even assume that our elected officials, that leadership is imbued in elected officials. And part of the message that I want to convey is that leadership is something that's demonstrated. We do ourselves and our communities a disservice when we think about leadership existing only in particular places, particularly those that are occupied by elected officials. Whereas these ideas of leadership and these concepts of service that can be motivated and oriented around love, really, we need people with those skill sets everywhere.
Yes.
And to break out of these kind of occupational bounds that tenet exists only within them, but to pull it out. And so these ideas of like servant leadership, I think is really important to be able to move ideas, people, communities, without necessarily having to be at the head of the line. It's really important.
That is so important. Yeah. I mean, and there's a beauty, in religious language or faith language, there's a great commandment, which is love God, love people. There's a simplicity about that, but it asks a lot of us. It invites us to something really significant. And I wonder what that invitation has looked like for you along the way here recently.
Oh, I think that's a really powerful point. You think about Corinthians, right? Or the definitions of love. Like, what is love?
Yeah.
What it lays out. Love is kind, love is patient. It never says love is easy, though.
Yeah.
Right? Easy is never one of them. And I find this idea of love is so fascinating because when you talk about love, there are those who will say, well, that is soft. That is not a strong enough reaction for these moments. And my response to that is, have you tried it?
Right.
Have you tried to love your neighbor in moments where you don't like your neighbor? Have you tried to think in love when you want to leave the room, or you want to leave the table, or you want to think only about the advancement of your family or your community? Like, have you really tried to think about love? And in those instances, love is hard, but it often leads us I would say, to a better outcome. And I think that's what we need to really orient around is where do we want to go? And what are the tools and tactics that can help us get there? And I believe love should be at the forefront.
That is so good. You're right. It's I hear this soft skills comment, and you're right. Try it. You can decide if it's soft after you've tried it. Don't tell me it's soft before you try it.
Right. Absolutely. And it's so you asked about some of my sort of the occupational journey, and you said soft skills. So I have to say, a lot of my career has been building a software company called SkillSmart, which is all about trying to understand people at the kind of skill level and helping them think about how a skill set from one walk of life might equip them in another walk of life. And it's about kind of breaking down these esoteric titles, right, to their components and helping people see, oh, that isn't beyond the reach, or that isn't exclusive there. That is a set of skills and talents that I can bring from different walks of life and employ there, or be trained in and then employ there. And so I feel the same way here when you talk about how do you use these skills, hard skills, soft skills, but how do you employ them in these really challenging moments? Like, that's what people need to see, that they have that capacity, they have the agency to actually employ skills for important outcome.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, so as I'm thinking, circling back now to sort of the essential story that you write about in your book, that there's the story of a church, a Black church that is formed out of Civil War and the land that was purchased. And then a century later, there's this harder season for that church. And the idea, maybe we talk about three churches becoming one. So all of that has, there's loss and there's pain. It's not a romantic, story. It's a real story. I wonder, how does some of that story speak to where we find ourselves right now in some of our current loss, pain, tension, difficult truth in this season?
Oh, it's such a good question. I talked about my being animated by that story because of the symbolism of that meeting taking place on April 4th, 1968, and Dr. King being assassinated in Memphis on April 4th, 1968. My mind was blown. What are the chances that might happen?
Yeah.
But Ellen, what struck me as I sat with my grandmother and all those people she would kick me out of her hospital room to go talk to was that experiment, which is an ongoing experiment, right? I wouldn't even call it successful yet because it's an ongoing experiment. But that experiment doesn't persist as long as it has without everything after April 4th, 1968. And I think that's such an important part of your question, because I think often we come to the moment and then forget about the rest of the work that allows us to kind of persist or have an opportunity to be successful. So you talk about the loss, you talk about the history, the culture, the identity that was wrapped up in each of those churches. Well, if that hadn't been respected, then they wouldn't have sort of made it as far as they have. I think about even the names. So the church that those three churches became, they didn't assume one of those names. They didn't assume one of those buildings. They built a new building. They took on a new name, and they sort of developed culture for that new space that borrowed from each of those three origin communities. And even the church name, Fairhaven, right, is a nod to the story where the Apostle Paul is being taken to Rome, and that ship sees rough seas, and they take refuge at the port of Fair Havens, right? And so even that symbolism, they knew that the coming together was not smooth sailing. The staying together would not be smooth sailing. And so to go ahead and heed some sanctuary, even in the word, about what they were going to be undertaking, I think was really important. And I was particularly moved by the intentionality of those folks. I'll call them the pioneers back in 1968, who were so dedicated to this being successful. After the merger decision, You show up in the new sanctuary, even though this vote is taking place, sanctuary was still often segregated. Black members sit on one side, white members might sit on the other. And there were individuals who raised their hands to be part of a team that would physically integrate those spaces. Can you imagine physically scrolling down the pew to go and sit in between people who have decided that they didn't want you to sit there, but with intention, knowing that this is what needs to happen, and that if you do it once today and do it again next Sunday, and you start to develop a practice that over time you can break some of these tensions. And we know that it's harder to hate when you're up close, right? To get proximate with people. One last story on that end. I interviewed he was then 100. He's now 102. When he was then 100, my grandmother's younger brother, who lives in Washington, D.C., and drives an hour out to the church. And he drives twice a week, once for choir practice and once for the service.
Wow.
And I asked him, I said, Uncle Tompkins, why do you still make this drive? There are integrated congregations dotted along the way now. You don't need to. And he said, Jason, it was very important that they see me, that my face be seen in the sanctuary choir on church on Sunday mornings. It was important in 1968. It's just as important now. And so that sort of dedication and intention to an idea is what's making this, daily possible.
Yeah, there's someone has talked about a long obedience in the same direction, sort of a thing. That it's one thing to make a big, exciting splash. It's another to faithfully, over a long, long journey, stay somewhere. And in a sense, that's what love does. Love's better at that latter sort of thing than just the real quick, do something big and move on kind of approach.
Oh, it's absolutely. I mean, I put it in the context of spiritual formation. Right? We know that there aren't these mountaintop moments. You don't get to summit. It is this state obedience. It is a practice. It's a learned practice, and there's a dedication to it, which I found really special to see. And I had lived it, but one of the things that was kind of eye-opening for me along the journey, Alan, was I was baptized in this church, Fairhaven, right? I grew up in an integrated sanctuary, right? Singing in the church choir. But I hadn't heard that origin story. And so I'd live my life. I go off to the White House. I get the call from my mother, and I'm sitting in my grandmother's room, and she tells me about 1968 and how racially divisive it was, and the context in which this decision was taking place. She told me about these three churches, and before she could say that they merged, I cut her off and I said, "Those three churches didn't merge, did they?" And she looked at me disappointed. She was like, "Jason, of course they did. It's Fairhaven. You've been there. You were baptized there." But something about living in the world, something about being out in the world made me think that sort of a decision wouldn't happen.
It's just impossible. Just
impossible. It'd be too hard.
Come on.
We push away from the table and say, you know what? Like, that's just asking too much. It's too hard. And so that's kind of to your point when you contextualize it today. Like, do we have the capacity to make that kind of a decision and then have that state obedience over time to sustain it?
That is so powerful. There's just such a need for the different ways now we find ourselves in camps or tribes or groups of certain conviction. And there's value in those convictions. But then we're not in any kind of fellowship with someone who has a different vision. And there was something unique that happened in these three churches coming together to become one church. That was hugely risky. That was immensely difficult to do. And I think only love would make it possible.
Yeah. I love that frame that you just said, by the way, because there's a deep appreciation for the three foundational churches too. Yeah, some people say, so is the message taken away here that everyone should merge into? No, but the idea here is that if our institutions aren't serving the opportunity to be in community, if it's not actually enabling people to be more proximate to people who don't think like them, then that's actually holding us back. And so whether you're in your own congregation on Sunday morning, but you're finding ways to engage a different congregation that has that doesn't look like you, that maybe worships differently, that has different orientation, that thinks about the world differently. Like that's what this is really trying to get us to think about. How do we, what sort of communities do we want to build? What role do we play in building them? And are the institutions in which we inhabit serving us in that right direction?
Yeah, that is so good. Well, I'd love to maybe circle back now to sort of your journey as a leader. You know, a lot of leaders in our listening audience, you know, they feel the pressure to move quickly, to produce, to stay ahead, to stay at a really intensive, you know, frantic, maybe anxious, maybe pace. You went on a journey from your experience in the White House to the bedside with your grandmother, and then the journey that you'd continued. I wonder if you can speak to maybe some of the wisdom, maybe that you could offer leaders who maybe they've lost touch with their roots. Maybe they've lost touch with what matters the most, and sort of your self-importance comment about what maybe was driving you early on. And share with our listeners some of that journey and the value of that journey.
Yeah. Thank you for that question. I'd say it's still ongoing in many respects.
Yes.
And this idea of constantly being in conversation about to what am I called to do? You know, one of my favorite hymns is "Here I am, Lord, is it I, Lord? I've heard you calling in the night. I will go if you lead me." Right? Like, and in what direction? And I think that sometimes we'll ask the question and answer our own question before we give God time to answer. I'm certainly guilty of that. And so I was sort of filling that space with things that were externally validated as important. That's all I ever wanted to do growing up. I wanted to do something significant. I wanted to make people's lives better. That was my goal. And so the White House was a wonderful platform to try and make people's lives better. But I forgot about the other pieces and I let it kind of consume me. I think that's the important. I'm not encouraging anyone to not take an opportunity at the White House. It's just maybe don't idolize that experience, and in so doing, block out the other components of life, like visiting family, like being proximate, like those missing births, right? I think that sort of consumed me. And so what was really fortunate for me, and this happens in life, is that I had a forcing event. My grandmother's phone call in the hospital room, forcing event. She was 95 years old. You know, she lived until she was 106. If I had known that she was going to live 11 more years, I probably don't leave the White House. I probably don't go and sit in that hospital room. I'd probably leave and go to New York and, go become a lawyer in the New York legal scene. And I missed this whole opportunity to sit with my grandmother and learn my story. And one of the things I appreciate now, looking back on it, is that when I was running around the White House between the ages of 27 and 31, trying to get people to listen to me, in retrospect, I didn't really have much to say. Like my time with my grandmother actually gave me my story because it gave me my foundation. It told me who we are, told me whose I was, right? Who I was and whose I was, where I came from, and a grounding that I think puts things in context in an important way, but also gives me an authority to engage in conversation in an important way. And so I wish it hadn't taken a forcing event, but I think as we're applying that concept more broadly, I think we need to appreciate forcing events in our lives. If we don't slow down, God will find a way.
Yeah.
Right? And so that slowdown will come. And in that slowdown, man, have I been blessed to be able to learn my story and my grandmother's story and sit with these individuals, but also understand the significance that you get from being with other people, right? To be able to, the importance of storytelling, sharing these stories with others, the power that exists, and really the agency. What I want people to come away with is that when you talk about the chaos that exists in the world today, I think a lot of people feel like the way to respond to that chaos is to grasp for control, and control can feel like isolating, can feel like pulling back. But you know, and I know that the opposite of chaos isn't control, it's connection. And so to
Yes.
be able to
Well
connect
said.
and be in community is how we move through these difficult times and move through them together.
That's so good. One of the things I sort of caught from what you wrote is you described community as something that we inherit, we steward. We sort of don't invent it from scratch. We don't make it happen. We receive it and we honor it. At least that's been my experience as well. How could that insight maybe shape the way faith leaders think about the people they serve, the places they serve?
Oh, I think it's a beautiful analogy, and I think we're stewards of community for the time that we have. Right. These
Yeah.
are and for your listeners who are shepherds of their flock, pastorally or organizationally, we have a responsibility, and that's not. I think going back to our conversation around love and leadership, that's not top down. That's middle out, right? And so, how do we
Yeah.
have within a community, how do we have shared responsibility? I want you to love my kid. The best way for you to love my child is for me to love yours. It's the best way for us to start to build shared responsibility and for us to then build shared values, for us to steward this community in a way that we can agree to the outcomes that we want and then work diligently to make that happen, right? And I feel like we get to do that together for the short amount of time that we get to, we inherit a set of values that if we're fortunate enough, we get to learn about, we get to sit long enough and learn some of those values, and then we get to tend to them, tend to our flock, right? And then we try and pass that on. Should we be so blessed, pass on to others to continue to steward that in a way that will sort of reap benefits that we'll never see.
That's so well said. Well, as we come to a close to our conversation, I wonder if I could just maybe ask a more general question. That would be, as our listeners will pick up your book and read it, what are some of the things you hope they'll catch from having read this story and your own journey, really, that's captured in these pages?
Well, thank you for the opportunity. I'm just so excited to share this story with your listeners, and I'm deeply appreciative of you taking the time to read the book and for them to read the book and watch the documentary. We just talked a little bit about one thing that I want people to really feel empowered coming through this story. When I learned about my great-great-grandfather and great-great-grandmother post-emancipation, you can imagine 1868, pooling together $54 to build the schoolhouse. I remember my grandmother was telling me this story. And I said, I was a Washington lawyer. I was skeptic, right? I said, Grandma, there had to be a safer way than building a building on the main drag and painting it white and saying we're educating Black children here. There had to be a safer, less conspicuous way. And my grandmother cut me off and said, Jason, there was no public education for Black children at that time. Your great-great-grandmother and your great-great-grandfather, they looked around their community, they saw a need, and they took action because they were doers and doers do. Because they were doers and doers do. And it was so profound for me from someone who was sort of I could analyze a situation to death. And here she said, there are people who look around their community and take action because they see a need and they're doers. And so I feel as though we're in a moment right now where people are looking around and they're feeling the chaos. There's an element of mayhem and they're not quite sure what to do. And they feel like it's happening to them and they have no agency in what the outcome can be. And I want them to know that if you get proximate, you operate where you are, you reach out to someone else in your community, there's so much that we can do. You can build a schoolhouse that benefited a generation 150 years later that you never even knew. We can plant the seeds that grow trees under which people will be given shade we'll never see. And so that's a significant takeaway I want people to walk away is that they have agency in this moment. They can be doers, and doers do.
I love that. And the doing that I hear you describing sounds like it's rooted in a kind of robust faith. It's a doing that's an expression of a deep and profound love. I mean, that's where the doing is coming from. And there's something beautiful about that.
And the doing there, Alan, also, I think, provides some answer in the uncertainty. When you start to act, right? In the concept of the social gospel, when you start to act, it gives you clarity, even when there's uncertainty. Let's act. Let's start to marshal in a direction, and more things will become clear, and more things will become clear. But the action, the paralysis by analysis is a real thing. Where we overthink, and then moments have passed. But where we see needs, where we can marshal people forward, it's amazing the community that builds accordingly.
Yeah, I love that so much. Well, thank you again. Today, again, my guest has been Jason G. Green, and we've been talking about his book, Too Precious to Lose. Jason, it's been such a pleasure to talk with you today.
I so appreciate the time. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you for listening to the Unhurried Living Podcast. To learn more about us, visit unhurriedliving.com. In the show notes, you'll find helpful links and information about our partner, Life Audio, and all of their other faith-centered podcasts.